Welcome to the deep dive. Let's just think for a second about diseases that honestly most of us kind of think of as being in the history books now. Things like polio, measles, even chickenpox. For a lot of us, the idea of these spreading widely, it feels, well, almost ancient, right? Hard to really imagine. We see them as pretty much banished. And that's largely thanks to, vaccines and the public health rules and mandates that have backed them up for generations. But what happens if those rules, the very things that helped keep these diseases cornered, what if they're suddenly being challenged? Not just talked about, but actually set up to be dismantled. So today, we're plunging right into a really pivotal and, let's be honest, pretty controversial development in public health policy. We're working from a recent article, really caught my eye, from the Boca Tribune. It just came out September 3rd, 2025. And it lays out Florida's plans, their explicit plans to get rid of those longstanding childhood vaccine mandates for kids going to school.
Right. And our goal here in this deep dive is really to unpack the main arguments. Look at the thinking behind it from all sides, because it's complex. We want to trace back the history a bit. How did these mandates even start? Explore what could happen if they go away, the potential impacts, and basically give you a really solid, unbiased look at what's going on. We're here to kind of distill the facts, lay out the different views, connect the dots for you, not to push any specific side, obviously, but just to equip you with a clear picture of what this is about and, frankly, why it matters so much, not just for Florida,
Okay, let's unpack this, because you're right. This isn't just some local story down in Florida. This feels like we've got a front row seat to this big national conversation heating up again about public health, about individual rights, where those lines are drawn, and, keeping communities safe. What happens here? It could really send ripples out, influence debates, maybe even policies, way beyond just Florida. So let's start right at the beginning. The announcement itself. That Boca Raton Tribune piece, it doesn't bury the lead, drops a bit of a bombshell right away. September 3rd, 2025, Governor Ron DeSantis, he's there with Surgeon General Joseph Ladapo, and they officially announced plans to eliminate all vaccine requirements for kids in Florida public schools. And the key thing here, the part that really shows how big a deal this is, the article says this would make Florida the first state in the nation to repeal these kinds of longstanding public health rules. That's more than just tweaking a policy, isn't it? It's a huge shift.
Oh, it absolutely is.
Yeah.
Monumental is not an exaggeration here. Being first in the nation on something like this, it's huge. It basically turns Florida into this large-scale, real-time experiment in public health policy. You got to think, this isn't just Florida passing a law for itself. It sets a precedent that you can bet every other state, public health officials, everyone will be watching like hawks. They won't just be watching either. They'll be digging into the data that comes out of Florida, the health outcomes, sure, but also the social impacts, the economic impacts, all of it. Will this become, a model for other states wanting more individual medical freedom? Or is it going to end up being a kind of cautionary tale, a stark reminder of why we had these collective protections in the first place? The results, whatever they are, could seriously shape laws, court cases, even just public opinion everywhere else, potentially for a whole generation. And it definitely signals a clear priority for Florida's leadership right now, a really strong focus on individual choice, and a real pushback against government mandates.
Even in areas like this that have historically been seen as vital for everyone's health, because these mandates, like the article says, they've been around for decades all over the U.S. They're kind of the bedrock of how schools have helped keep communities safe from infectious diseases. So taking them apart, that's fundamentally rethinking that bedrock, and that has massive implications.
And just to be clear, we're not talking about some brand new controversial vaccine here, right? The proposal, the one they announced Tuesday, it specifically targets mandates for shots against really well-known diseases. We're talking measles, polio, hepatitis B, chickenpox. I mean, these are the vaccines that generations of school kids have gotten. These are the illnesses that not that long ago, really, were a constant serious threat.
Exactly. And that's such a critical point. Why these specific vaccines is because each one, measles, polio, hep B, chickenpox, represents a major public health battle that vaccines largely won over decades of effort. Let's just, think back for a minute. Polio. It used to cast this shadow of fear every single summer in the U.S. People were terrified. Pools closed, quarantines happened, and you had those awful images of kids in iron lungs just to breathe. It caused paralysis, lifelong problems, and it killed people. Measles. It was so common, people almost thought of it as just something kids got, a rite of passage. But it wasn't mild. It could lead to really bad pneumonia, ear infections causing deafness, even brain swelling and encephalitis, which could be fatal. Hepatitis B, often silent at first, but it could lead to chronic problems down the line, serious liver damage, cirrhosis, liver cancer even. And chickenpox maybe seems less scary today. That itchy rash, the fever, will have still meant significant illness, kids missing school for some serious complications like bad bacterial infections, pneumonia, or brain inflammation.
What's really striking, I think, is how unfamiliar these diseases are to many people today, especially younger parents, younger generations. They haven't seen them firsthand. They're mostly stories from grandparents or things you read about. And that lack of direct experience, that's a direct result of how incredibly successful these vaccination programs and the mandates supporting them have been. They built up that community immunity. The fact that these diseases are rare now, it's not luck. It's the direct outcome of decades of public health work and these requirements. So by going after these foundational vaccines, Florida's plan is directly challenging the very things that protected communities from diseases that were once incredibly common, incredibly devastating, and deeply feared. It feels to many like risking forgetting some really hard-learned lessons from our past.
That history is just so important, isn't it? Because it immediately tells you why the reaction is so strong. We're not debating something new here. These are the basics that kept people safe for ages, which brings us right to the why. The reason they gave for this pretty bold move, Dr. Ladapo, he called it a win for parental choice and bodily autonomy. And Governor DeSantis, he put it in the context of his, quote, broader campaign against government mandates. Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. That clash between individual liberty and public health. What exactly are they arguing here? What do those terms mean in this context?
Yeah, this is really where you see the core philosophy behind the policy, and it's crucial to understand it properly. Parental choice, bodily autonomy. These aren't just catchphrases. They tap into some really deep-seated American ideas about rights, about freedom. Bodily autonomy is the idea that fundamentally you control your own body. You get to make your own medical decisions without someone forcing you. And when it comes to kids, that right usually rests with the parents. They're seen as having the primary say in their children's health care, their upbringing. So from that viewpoint, vaccine mandates can look like the government overstepping, like an infringement on those basic rights, interfering in personal, family decisions. It's a perspective that really prioritizes empowering individuals, empowering families to make their own health choices free from what they see as state coercion. And Governor DeSantis framing it as part of a wider push against government mandates. That fits right in. It connects with people who are generally distrustful of government power, especially when it touches personal life. People who prioritize individual freedom very highly, maybe even over collective safety nets, especially if those nets involve mandates. For them, getting rid of these requirements isn't reckless. It's about restoring liberty back to parents, back to individuals. They argue the government's role should be limited, especially when it comes to personal health. This view often questions just how far the government's police power, its authority to protect public health, should really go. They might say, okay, sanitation laws, sure, maybe mandatory school, fine. But vaccines, that crosses a line into private medical decisions. It infringes too much on fundamental rights. It's a potent argument, Comes from a specific way of looking at liberty and the role of the state.
It is a powerful way to frame it. But I can hear someone listening thinking, okay, but if I choose not to vaccinate my kid, and heaven forbid my kid gets sick, isn't that my family's issue? Why is it the government's business or my neighbor's business? How do the public health folks answer that direct challenge, that idea that it's purely a personal risk?
That is exactly the point of tension, isn't it? And that's where the other side comes crashing in immediately and very strongly condemning this. The Boca Raton Tribune article, it quotes House Democratic leader Fentress Driscoll from Tampa, she didn't pull any punches, called the plan stunningly reckless. And she said flat out, quote, DeSantis wants to trade the health of our kids for media headlines. That's a really pointed accusation. What's the implication there about why this policy is being put?
Yeah, that's incredibly direct. That quote from Driscoll, it doesn't just criticize the policy on its merits, it goes straight for the motivation behind it. Using words like stunningly reckless, accusing the governor of trading health for headlines. She's trying to frame this as irresponsible, maybe even dangerous, and driven not by health concerns or even genuine belief in autonomy, but by politics. It suggests that the decision is maybe a calculated move. Grab headlines, fire up the base, score political points, rather than being about sound public health. That kind of language definitely ramps up the stakes. It turns it from just a policy debate into something with, moral dimensions. And it fuels the emotion around it all, absolutely. It implies maybe a misuse of power, especially concerning kids.
And it's not just abstract political talk. Her condemnation is tied directly to fears about specific, potentially awful health outcomes.
Driscoll's warning brings us back to that history we were just talking about. She used that really vivid phrase, warning about the return of child killers. She said, and this is serious stuff, that Florida would be welcoming back child killers like polio and measles with open arms if the mandates fall. Then she got specific, reminding people what these diseases actually do. Polio, she said, can paralyze muscles, and both can kill. Measles can cause pneumonia and brain swelling, and both can kill. Hepatitis B, she reminded people, destroys your liver. Even chickenpox, which many think of as mild, causes high fever and a painful rash and can have serious side effects. And her key point, these diseases devastated families and stole lives for years before vaccines were developed to protect us.
What's really striking there is how quickly the opposition brings up that history, that collective memory. It's easy to forget, maybe, how bad things were. But Driscoll and others are saying, hold on, remember why we have these rules. Like you said, my own grandmother used to talk about polio season. Real fear. For a lot of parents today, these are just names in a book. They haven't seen it, which is ironically because the vaccines work so well. So what was it actually like back then, before these shots were standard?
That's such an important question because it puts Driscoll's words into context. Before widespread vaccination, life was profoundly different. Take polio. Summers weren't just hot, they were scary. This wasn't just a possibility, it was an annual dread. Kids would get sick, sometimes suddenly paralyzed, hospitals filled up. Those iron lungs, they were a real visible symbol of that fear. Thousands were left disabled for life. Many died. Communities felt this deep anxiety. Public places closed. It affected everything. And measles. Before the vaccine, basically every kid got it. It was almost expected. But it wasn't trivial. It spread like crazy through schools, neighborhoods, caused high fevers, the rash, sure, but also serious complications. Pneumonia was common. Ear infections leading to deafness. And that brain swelling, encephalitis. About 1 in 1,000 kids. Life-threatening. Families lived with this constant background threat. Suffering. Long recoveries, the unimaginable grief of losing a child to something we can now prevent. Hep B, too, carried this long-term risk of chronic liver disease, cancer. And even chickenpox meant weeks of misery, parents missing work, and for some kids, really dangerous secondary infections or neurological problems. So when Driscoll uses those vivid descriptions, she's trying to shock us back into remembering the why behind the mandates. Why society, decades ago, decided widespread vaccination wasn't just a good idea, it was a public health necessity. Not just for the one kid getting the shot, but for everyone. For community health, for stability. It forces us to think about the progress we've made and what it could mean to intentionally reverse that. It's not just history, it's about reevaluating the choices that led us to a much healthier present.
And her argument wasn't only about how bad the diseases were, but also about how well the vaccines work against them. She emphasized, they're all preventable, but only if our kids take the vaccines. And she really pushed parents to talk to their family doctor, saying these vaccines are safe, tested, and essential to protecting public health. It really gets to that idea that preventing these things, especially the really contagious ones, depends on almost everyone getting vaccinated, right?
That's precisely it. And that statement, it goes right to the heart of public health strategy for infectious diseases. The concept of community immunity, or what most people call herd immunity. When Driscoll says prevention relies on widespread vaccination, she's talking about more than just protecting your own child. She's talking about building a protective wall around the entire community. Think of it like a wildfire. If enough houses have cleared brush around them, the fire struggles to spread. It protects even the houses that might be more vulnerable. It's similar with vaccines. When a really high percentage of people are vaccinated, usually somewhere between, say, 80%, 95%, depending on the disease's contagiousness, the virus or bacteria just can't find enough susceptible people to keep spreading easily. And this collective shield. It's absolutely critical for people who can't get vaccinated. We're talking babies too young for certain shots, people with immune systems weakened by cancer treatment or other illnesses, folks on certain medications, or those with severe allergies to vaccine ingredients. Their safety literally hinges on the vaccination choices of everyone around them. The math of it is pretty clear. If vaccination rates drop below that critical point, even by a little bit, you start getting these pockets where the disease can get a foothold again. It finds those unvaccinated individuals and can spark outbreaks really quickly. And those outbreaks hit the most vulnerable people the hardest. So Driscoll's argument, and the argument of public health officials worldwide, is that individual choice, while obviously important, can't be the only factor when dealing with highly contagious diseases. The decision not to vaccinate can have effects beyond your own family. It can impact the health of a whole school, a whole town, putting others at risk. This is where that tension between individual liberty and collective good gets really sharp.
And it's where public health has historically argued for policies that prioritize protecting the whole population, especially in shared spaces like schools. It's a tough balance, yeah, but one that's traditionally leaned towards collective protection for these kinds of diseases.
And it's not just Driscoll raising these flags. Her worries are shared widely in the public health world. The article explicitly states public health officials echoed her concerns. It points out that vaccines are credited with nearly eradicating once devastating diseases in the United States. And the experts are warning that getting rid of mandates could reverse decades of progress, leaving Florida vulnerable to outbreaks that had largely been relegated to history books. Quote, if we step back and look at the bigger picture, what does reversing decades of progress actually mean for a state like Florida? What are the ripple effects beyond just sick individuals?
Yeah, connecting it to the bigger picture, reversing decades of progress is, well, it's a pretty stark warning. It goes way beyond just counting cases. It means potentially facing public health crises that our modern society has largely forgotten how to deal with, and frankly, isn't really set up to handle on a large scale anymore. Just think about our healthcare system today. Is it really prepared for widespread polio cases needing long-term intensive care, rehab, maybe even things like iron lungs? No. Is it ready for huge measles outbreaks that will require mass isolation, specialized staff, massive contact tracing efforts across entire communities? That takes immense resources, time, money. Our preparedness for these specific threats has naturally decreased because, thankfully, they became rare. A major outbreak of just one of these diseases wouldn't just swamp hospitals, meaning other important surgeries get canceled, treatments for cancer or heart disease get delayed. It would also trigger huge economic and social costs. You'd be looking at potentially long school closures. That disrupts education massively, creates huge problems for working parents, leading to lost wages. Businesses would lose productivity. And think about Florida's economy. Tourism is gigantic. What happens if Florida gets known as a place where measles or polio is circulating? That could be devastating. Plus, think of the public money. Funds that now go to roads, schools, environmental projects. A lot of that would suddenly have to be redirected to emergency health responses, treatment, containment. It's like a domino effect, hitting everything from health to the economy to social stability, even just the general feeling of safety in the community as that old fear creeps back in. The experts are basically saying Florida might be gambling with all of that, its health, its economy, its social functioning, by potentially tearing down the fences that kept these dangers out. It's a potential return to a level of public health threat that most people alive today just haven't experienced and aren't ready for.
So the fear from the opposition is very real, very tangible, a return to a past nobody wants. And it's not just about vaccinate or don't vaccinate, full stop. Driscoll also made that point that parents already have flexibility through medical and religious exemptions. That seems important because it suggests there's already a way to handle individual circumstances within the current rules.
That's a really critical detail she brings up, absolutely. Because it pushes back against the idea that completely throwing out the mandates is the only way to achieve parental choice. What she's pointing out is that the system already has built-in ways to accommodate specific legitimate reasons why a child might not be vaccinated. Medical exemptions, those are standard. They're for kids who genuinely can't get vaccinated for health reasons, maybe a severe allergy, maybe they have cancer, or some other condition that weakens their immune system so much that a vaccine would be dangerous for them. And then most states, including Florida currently, also have religious exemptions for families whose deeply held religious beliefs genuinely forbid vaccination. The difference between that system and a total repeal is huge. The current exemptions are designed to be specific, targeted. They try to balance individual needs with the bigger goal of keeping everyone safe by maintaining high vaccination rates overall. They acknowledge those rare cases where a vaccine isn't right for someone, medically or because of faith, but they still aim to protect the community herd. But a blanket repeal, like the one proposed, that just throws the balance way off. It would essentially extend the choice not to vaccinate to anyone, for any reason, even if there's no medical or religious basis for it. It effectively prioritizes an individual preference, which might be based on anything, accurate information or not, over the collective safety provided by community immunity, especially in a crowded place like a public school. So it really raises the question, does a full repeal actually address a real unmet need for legitimate choice? Or does it just broaden choice so much that undermines the health protection of the entire school and the wider community? That's the core of the disagreement there.
Okay, so it's definitely not a done deal yet. The Boca Raton Tribune article is clear. The proposal still requires legislative action and is likely to face legal challenges. So what happens next? This announcement isn't the end. It's really just the beginning of what sounds like a pretty long and complicated fight. What does that road ahead actually look like?
You're absolutely right. This is just the first step
in what's almost guaranteed to be a drawn-out battle, both in the legislature and in the courts. In Florida, for this to become law, it first has to be written up as a formal bill. Then that bill has to go through committees in both the Florida House and the Senate. And those committee hearings, that's where you'll hear from everyone: public health experts, doctors groups, school officials, parents on both sides of the issue, advocacy groups. They'll all testify. It's a key stage where public pressure and lobbying can really make a difference. The bill would then have to pass votes on the floor of both chambers. It could get amended along the way, maybe watered down, maybe toughened up. If it manages to pass both, then it goes to the governor's desk to be signed into law. But even alongside that whole legislative journey, you can pretty much count on lawsuits being filed almost immediately if it looks like it's moving forward. Public health organizations, medical groups, maybe groups representing kids with weak immune systems, even individual families who feel their kids are being put in danger that could all sue. The legal arguments could be varied. Maybe that the repeal violates the state's duty to protect public health, or that it denies kids the right to a safe school environment, or that it just ignores decades of medical science. These court battles could go on for a long time, potentially involving appeals, maybe even reaching federal courts, depending on the arguments used. So the timeline, we could be talking months, easily, maybe even years for all this to play out. And throughout it all, public opinion, media coverage, lobbying, all that will be swirling around, influencing things. It's going to be messy and unpredictable.
And like we've touched on, this whole thing just throws into sharp relief how political this issue has become. The article notes Governor DeSantis framed it as part of his fight against government mandates. But opponents, they say kids' health is being put on the line for political reasons. Those are two completely different stories about what's driving this and what the consequences are, right? They paint totally opposite pictures.
Absolutely. They are fundamentally conflicting narratives, and they really define the battlefield here, ideologically and practically. On one side, you have the framing from Governor DeSantis. This is about principle. It's about freedom from government overreach. It taps into that deep belief in individual liberty, limited government. The policy is presented as just being consistent with that philosophy. It's an argument that resonates strongly with people who feel mandates, even well-intentioned ones, are just too much government intrusion into private life. It frames it as a fight for autonomy against maybe a nanny state. Then on the other side, you have the opponents. Their framing focuses laser-like on the potential negative outcomes, the tangible dangers, and they question the motives. They say children's health is being risked, maybe even sacrificed for political gain. This narrative emphasizes the very real threat of diseases coming back, and it paints the policy as a cynical move about headlines or energizing a base or advancing a career, not about kids' well-being. These aren't just slightly different ways of talking about it. They shape how people understand the whole issue, how the media covers it, how voters react. One side talks about the ideal of liberty. The other warns about concrete harm to vulnerable kids. Both use powerful language. And for us, listening and trying to understand, it's crucial to see these as the claims and the framings being put forward by each side in a really polarized environment. Not necessarily objective truth, but the way each side wants the issue to be seen. Understanding those competing narratives is key to grasping the whole conflict.
And while all this plays out, the legislative fights, the court cases, the war of words Florida, as the article says, finds itself at the center of a national conversation over public health, parental choice, and the balance between individual rights and community safety. This really has become bigger than Florida, hasn't it? It feels like it's tapping into this core tension we see across the country.
Well, completely. This situation in Florida, it crystallizes a really fundamental and often pretty uncomfortable question for the whole country, maybe even globally. It forces us to confront that basic tension between what I, as an individual, want to do and what we, as a community, need to do to stay safe, especially with the public health. Now, this isn't a brand new fight. Societies have wrestled with this for ages. Think about mandatory quarantines back in the day, or seatbelt laws more recently, or these vaccine rules. But the Florida situation brings it roaring back, maybe with extra intensity given our current political climate. Where do we draw that line? Who decides when one person's choice poses a risk to others, especially vulnerable people? Does a parent's right to decide for their child override the need to keep a school safe for all kids, including those who can't be vaccinated? Or does the government have a valid reason, backed by science and history, to set rules that protect the collective, even if it limits some individual choices? This debate reflects these broader values and anxieties playing out everywhere, right? Especially after the last few years pushed these exact questions right into everyone's face. What Florida decides in the end, and how the legal challenges shake out. That could absolutely influence other states. It might embolden states thinking along similar lines, give them a sort of legal or political template. Or
If things go badly in Florida, if we see outbreaks, strain on hospitals, economic hits, it could serve as a really stark warning, making other states pause. It really is a national test case. And the results, health-wise, legally, socially, economically, everyone will be watching very, very closely. It could reshape how America approaches public health for a long time.
Which brings us right back to you, the listener. Doesn't really matter where you live, Florida or elsewhere. These core questions about public health, government's role, individual liberty, they're everywhere. So how does digging into what's happening in Florida help you make sense of similar arguments if or when they pop up in your own backyard?
Yeah, I think understanding this Florida case gives you, the listener, a really useful lens to look through when these debates happen elsewhere. It helps you spot the different arguments being made, to kind of parse the rhetoric around parental choice versus public health, to see how history plays into it. You'll be maybe better equipped to think through the possible consequences, the ones people intend, the ones they don't, the short-term effects, the long-term ones, of policies that really do affect everyone. It's really about fostering that critical thinking, right? Not just swallowing one side's story whole, but weighing the arguments, understanding the different values at play, recognizing what's really at stake when we make policy changes around something as basic as health and safety in our communities, especially for kids. It just helps you be a more informed participant in these really important discussions. Hashtag tag outro up.
So we've really walked through how Florida is standing at this difficult intersection. You've got these deeply held beliefs clashing, that strong call for parental choice, for bodily autonomy, running right up against these urgent, serious warnings from doctors and health experts about bringing back diseases we thought we'd beaten, diseases that are preventable. It's complex, it's emotional, and it's incredibly important.
And as we watch Florida move down this path, potentially setting a precedent, igniting this national debate even further, it really does leave us with a tough question to chew on, doesn't it? What responsibility do we owe each other, especially the most vulnerable among us? When one person's health decision can ripple outwards and affect a whole community, what does public health even mean anymore in a society that seems to be putting individual choice increasingly above almost everything else?
Yeah.
That's a question I think for all of us to keep thinking about well after this deep dive is over.